people in the world. That means that, for example, 3 million people that are the poorest people in the world now own as much money as 300 individuals in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that the gap between the rich and poor is very huge. And because it is a status quo, we believe that our problem today in today's society derives from that. We see that because of this gap, there is a huge distance between the distance between the harsh reality of majority of people, between harsh reality that majority of poor people need to deal with, and the other group of people that have lots of money and can live a normal and decent life. So we see that in this other group of people that are very influential, very important, have lots of money, are also politicians that should change that. So what we see in today's healthcare situation is that it is bad. Healthcare today is bad because the situation in the society is not okay. There are in hospitals, there are long lines. People need to wait lots of months in order to get to have the surgery. Their hospitals are understaffed, which means that individual doctors need to work more, and that equipment in the hospitals could be better. And the politicians are the ones that regulate healthcare, and we believe that they should be also able to change it and to have influence. But because there is such a big distance between those two groups, because these politicians are not in the touch with the reality of the majority of their voters, we see that because of that, there is a difference. They don't have the same frame references, and those two groups are very distant. So we see that politicians that have the power, that have the influence, authority and money should be able to change them. So what we are going to do today is to show you that the healthcare is very important, and the job of politicians is to change that, and we'll show you that with our policy they will be more in the touch of the reality. We'll present you that in 2 arguments. The first will be presented by me, and I'll talk about the importance of healthcare. And the next argument will be presented by Christina, and she'll talk about the nature of politicians. But before I move to our constructive case, I'd like to start with the definitions. Now, firstly, because we talk about elected politicians, we of course talk about democracies, because politicians are only elected in democracies. We're not talking about certain regimes or something else. What the state-run means, it means state-run services, public hospitals, public healthcare centers, and so on. So we see that while in office is also a very important word in our motion, that means that politicians are in office, they are working as politicians, during their mandate. And this is very important because during that time, they are able to make the policies, they are able to change policies because they are working as politicians during their mandate. And we believe that also they are representing the majority while being politicians, which means that because they're representing the majority, they should do something for the majority of people when it comes to healthcare. Nothing. So what medical treatment is, it is when politicians need medical treatment, of course, any kind of medical treatment, except when they are in life-threatening situations. Because at that time, everyone, in every single doctor, it doesn't matter whether he's working in a private practice or in a public hospital, needs to take care of you. So we're not talking about life-threatening situations, because then any doctor will take care of the politicians. Because their Hippocratic oath, because of that they should take care of everyone. It doesn't matter whether they are politicians or not. So now when we've dealt with that, I'm going to move to our constructive case and present you our argument, the importance of healthcare. What we see is that people's rights should be equal for everyone. They should be equal for everyone. They should be the same for everyone, because everyone in our society is human and it deserves to have a decent life. So the healthcare today and the health itself is very important for the society, for people, for individuals. It is a value because firstly, health is the basis of everything. That means that if you're healthy, you're able to contribute to the society, you're able to work to fulfill yourself, you're able to do what you want, you're able to self-actualize, to contribute to the society, and we believe that if you're healthy, if you're not damaged by certain flaw in the healthcare system, then if you are healthy, you're also able to cover other areas of your because you have this health. And we also believe that the health is a value today. We don't want to put the price on the lot. We believe that health is a value. That's why everyone should have access to the good healthcare in order to be healthy and in order to fulfill themselves. So because we have this social contract, because the people give away certain human rights in order for the government to provide then certain rights, safety for all the other people, in order for government to regulate the life, in order for other people to be safer, to have a regulated life, to live in peace, in order for that, the government is, because of the social contract, also the one that should provide healthcare, good healthcare to everyone, because this is their job. This is why voters voted for them. So we see that even though we are living in capitalistic society, even though some people work more, have more money, and then, need to have some priorities. For example, they're able to, build 2 balconies instead of 1, or have bigger house instead of, a small block of flat. We believe that if they have more money, that doesn't mean that they should have better access to healthcare, because today healthcare is very important and health is the value, which means that everyone should have the same access to this. So we see that people that have more rights, for example, that more money, it doesn't mean that they should also have more rights. So what we see today is that because politicians aren't in the touch with the reality, because they don't wait in those long lines, because of that, they don't see that polarization. They don't see how healthcare isn't accessible to everyone in the same amount. They don't see how health is an important value and everyone should possess it in order to fulfill themselves. But because we believe that health is such an important value, and because of our policy, politicians will now be able to get involved in the reality of majority. That means that they'll be able to be in touch with the society, and they'll be able to see how this value is not equally spread in the societies. And because of our policy, they will be able to change that. So we believe that if you believe that health is very important value, and if you want health for the majority and for everyone, you should vote for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, and I would like to call Lodin to deliver the speech.
The saddest thing about proposition is that they punished people for being rich, for being influential, instead of trying to uplift those at the bottom. And that is a major flaw in the mechanism, because they never really provided any justification besides the fact that they're too rich and they're too powerful. Even though we argue this is something that politicians deserve, because politicians play an incredibly integral role in your policy making, in the running of your country. And that's why we think that politicians need to have private care, because we think this is something that's a lot more efficient for these politicians, something I'm going to prove further on in my substatues. But first, let's look at what they told us. Firstly, on their non-existent policy. Secondly, on the importance of healthcare. So let's move on to their policy. They never actually gave us a policy on how they're going to enforce this. And why is this significant? Because it means that politicians can just flout this policy. They don't even have to abide by the rules. Because if you look at it, politicians have the ability to just fly overseas, because they possess things like private jets. And therefore, there isn't going to be anyone preventing them from flying overseas and getting private treatment. Now, the second layer of analysis, we think that no one's going to dare to impose this on your politicians anyway. So, on their side, they never actually outlined any punitive measures. So, we're going to assume if your president goes to a private hospital, they're going to have someone arrested. We don't think this is something that's feasible, and we challenge the second speaker to actually bring up a viable mechanism where their policy can actually work. Because this is a policy debate, we think they've already failed in their word. But on to what they told us on the importance of healthcare. They told us, they spent most of this substantive telling us that healthcare is incredibly important for the people. And we agree completely, ladies and gentlemen. We think healthcare is important. But you must recognize that's what your public services are for in the first place. That's why you have public services which are free of charge, provided by the state, so that the public can get access to essential services. But more than that, we recognize that whilst essential services, there is also always a gradation of services. There are services that are more extensive, which is your private care. And why is this necessary? Because you recognize that your state cannot provide such a high amount and a highly extensive care because it's incredibly taxing on state resources. And that's why we think there's always a gradation of services, and just because it's essential, we already provide that for you, and we don't think they're justified. But more than that, they told us how governments are going to be incentivized to improve this for the people. We don't think this stands, because as they already told us in their first speaker, governments are democratic. What this therefore means is that governments have a huge incentive to provide the best healthcare as possible for the people. Why? Because healthcare is a huge factor in determining who you actually vote for in the government. Because it's a basic service, because it's so essential to you. If the government doesn't provide good healthcare, you aren't going to vote for that party. And that's why we think the incentive already exists on our side of the house. We think the policy is unnecessary and unfair to these politicians. But why is their policy even worse for things like stratification? Because it's worse when you can see a politician in the same ward as you who can pay for far better wards, who can pay and actually have far better treatment within his public hospitals because the doctors are far better at treating him because they recognize his status as a politician. We think it's these kinds of visceral signals that really entrench the divide between the rich and poor, something their side never justified. But before I go on, yes.
Why is it because someone is so better, he of course deserves more than someone else because he is poor?
No, we argue that politicians should have the ability to choose whether they want private or public services. That's the right that extends to every individual, ladies and gentlemen. It isn't a right that's just granted to politicians. That's something they've never recognized. Their side is the one that's unfair on only enforcing this on politicians. And we argue, by the logic, they will make politicians stay in ghettos. They will make politicians all politicians' children go to public schools because they think this makes them necessarily improve the situation. Therefore, on their side, they have an incredibly unrealistic notion of punishing politicians and making them go to public hospitals and, by extension, living in ghettos. The stance for today is that we argue that we must respect the separation between personal and private lives, and the choices that these politicians make in their private sphere doesn't affect the policies and public decisions they make. The first speaker, I will tell you about the autonomy of politicians, secondly about meeting the needs of the politician, and the second speaker will tell you about depriving the public of essential services, and secondly about disincentivizing individuals from becoming politicians. On to my first subject on the autonomy of the politician. The thesis and argument is this: the personal decisions of a politician should be left to his own decisions and autonomy. Medical decisions are highly personal and important to every individual because it's something that actually affects your health, that actually affects the way you live. Therefore, individuals should have the ability to choose whichever medical service best protects their needs, because you recognize that individuals have very diverse medical needs and medical preferences. Therefore, each individual has the ability to choose whether he wants to patronize a public service or a private service. And we argue that this right naturally extends to politicians as well, because politicians are normal individuals like us. Therefore, we recognize there's a clear dichotomy between a politician's private and public positions, where his public position should have an impact and curtail his private rights. For example, elected politicians don't have the obligation to send their children to public schools, even though education is an important concern, even though public schools are competent. Or, for example, presidents of secular countries don't have to be secular themselves, which means that presidents can have their own religions while governing a secular country. And this is the kind of things that happens in status quo, and that's why we don't think that their policy is justified. On to my second point then, on meeting the needs of the politician. The thesis of Allen insists politicians require immediate care and treatment that is far better under private hospitals. Private-run services operate on a profit incentive, and this means that private hospitals make as efficient use of resources as possible, and they operate extremely quickly. Moreover, because private hospitals are actually specialized and they cater to very different medical needs, therefore, the demand for each specific private medical service is far lower and it's spread out. Conversely, your state-run services cater to the general public, which means they have a huge variety of services, which means demand for them is extremely high. And this means your waiting list is extremely long. What happens then? When politicians are forced to wait on the waiting list for extremely long, this means they cannot run the country. And this is important because we already recognize that you need politicians to fill in office. We need them to elect in office as soon as possible. When they are prevented from doing so, we think this hinders the running of the country. You cannot make important decisions. You cannot get representation within the parliament if the politician is always waiting on a waiting list for things like a kidney transplant, for things like an operation. Something that their side cannot justify. For example, before the NHS was privatized in the UK, an average waiting time for a kidney transplant was 6 years. Namik Electro, Vice President of Uzbekistan, required overseas treatment for a heart transplant just because his own public hospitals didn't have it. Therefore, we've shown you that because your politicians are so integral, because you should never punish them, we think we are very proud to stand on oppositions.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to move on to the living.
I would be really sad if I was forced to live in a state run by today's opposition, because what today's opposition stands for, what they've been telling us, is that a politician's life is worth more than my life. This is what opposition stands for, this hypocritical thing that just because I have more money, just because I have more influence, just because I have a greater authority, I am more important than you. Because if this is bad and reasonably wrong, because as soon as we comply to that, as soon as we live in a state like that, we'll come to a status, to a situation when we will have abuses of power, when we will have mistreatment, when we will have abuses of power leading to living off of normal citizens and abusing them just so we can be better off. And this is a bad world this opposition tries to force us to live in. So, before going on to our constructive, I will start with a rebuttal. First of all, I would like to tackle the point how they were saying to us we have provided no mechanisms for how we will implement this. First of all, this is a valid debate whether something should or should not be implemented. And because of that, we believe that we are discussing this, of course, on a global scale, because this should be implemented in every kind of state. So then politicians could not just fly overseas to another state, because all states would have this mechanism implemented. Second of all, what would be the mechanism if you would want? Criminalize people? Well, they could not access the private hospitals. I think we believe this is really simple. If you are a politician, you are forced to not go to a private hospital. You will have to use the public hospital. It's not that hard to distinguish between two buildings in which is right for you and which is not. Furthermore, now to go to what was also said by today's opposition. First of all, they said you, as the proposition, want to punish someone for being rich and powerful and offered us no justification. We have offered justification to this opposition. They obviously just misheard it. First of all, those people that are rich, powerful, with authority, in majority of cases are rich and powerful because they abuse the vast majority. They abuse the poor people. For $90, you can buy a person. We live in this kind of a world. We live in a world where people are rich just rich, Marx said a majority has to be really, really poor. And this is the world today, when buildings and companies are being, and plants are being moved to other parts of the world, so you have cheap labor there. This is why people are rich. This is why we have politicians also as part of that rich group that abuse others. So we believe this is justification enough, because we do not want to live in a world where people are better off just because they're rich and powerful, and yes, we punish them for that. Furthermore, the point about how we would, the services cannot be equally good, the private ones and the public ones. Yes, they cannot be equally good because politicians are not in touch with the people, are not in touch with the same lives, and they cannot change them. If politicians would walk a mile in the shoes of their citizens, they would see the horrible conditions, therefore they would change it and make the public sector just as efficient and just as good as private. No, thank you, madam. So we believe this would change it. The point about how governments as such have an incentive to take care of their citizens, so yes, they would take care of them in order to be re-elected. We believe this logic fails because if, as a voter, I have to choose the best out of the worst, ladies and gentlemen. If I have 10 people to choose from and vote for one, and if all 10 people will not take care of me, then it makes no difference if they have incentive or not, because let's face it, politicians either don't realize the situation or don't care, and I will discuss it furthermore in our argument. Now to the point how even if we implement our policy, it will not be efficient because doctors will treat politicians better. We believe, yes, exactly, they will treat politicians better because they are understaffed, because they don't have enough equipment, because lines are longer and politicians have the money to offer it to the doctors, so doctors will take them further. But if we implement this policy, this huge gap between rich and the poor will be eliminated, and the politicians will not have more money to offer to doctors, so they will not be taking ahead. Furthermore, thank you, madam. The point about how politicians have the right to choose for themselves. Yes, we believe politicians have the right to choose. Also, the people have the right to choose. But the reality check for today's opposition, not all of people also have the conditions to choose. And this is what we are changing. All of the persons in our society have the right to choose, but not all have the conditions to choose what is best for them. And we are going to fix this with this policy. The point about private schools and education. Yes, we also believe education is really important, and this is just a milestone. We believe that in a long-term effect, what will happen from healthcare as a basis, as we have proven to be basis for other areas, this will transfer to the point when other areas will be implemented, because politicians will see the real conditions in life. And now the argument, the point about opposition, how politicians require special treatment because they are more efficient in use of services, is actually my argumentation, so I will just move to that. Now, in my argumentation, what is the role of politicians? I would like to divide my argument into two major points. But before I do so, please, madam.
Will you then take away 90% of a rich person's money and distribute it so that everyone is equally equal?
Yes, we would. Furthermore, first of all, to start off, the principal analysis of what a politician should do. What is a politician? Today's opposition portrays you a picture how a politician is a ruler. No, we disagree. In a definition, in a principle, politician is a public servant. They serve the people. They are elected to do good for the people, to the majority who voted for them. They are not rulers, they are public servants. In a moment when a politician is being elected, they are no longer an individual. They are the voice of the majority that voted for a politician. They are the voice of majority of the middle class and the poor, because only a minority is that rich, as we have proven to you in statistics. Thank you, madam. So what we believe, if you as a politician cannot serve the people, then you should not be a politician. This is also the point they made about what we don't care what happens in a private life of a politician. When you are a politician, you from day to night serve the people. So we believe this is our justification to interfere here. When you are elected, you need to provide for the people. But unfortunately, we live in the 21st century and we have to do a reality check. So to go to the second part of my argument, what in reality happens? Let us look at what the majority of elected politicians are. The majority of elected politicians come from a better off families. They were better off since they were born. They had better education. They had better social status. They had some sort of tradition. Maybe their families, nepotism is quite common in today's world. So what we believe, because they were better off for the whole of their lives, when they are in office, they are used to having better access to instantaneous private healthcare, plus with having higher state salaries, they have even greater access to enter private hospitals. So because of that, we have two possible situations. The first situation would be politicians that don't care what is going on because they didn't experience it. You know, the famous quote, "Don't judge a person unless you walk a mile in their shoes." This is exactly what is going on. Politicians don't care, don't know what is going on, or don't care what is going on. So these are the possible situations. But what will happen if we implement our policy? Those two situations will suddenly be eliminated because if a person is going to be required to go through a system like every other citizen, then they will have a new motivation. Before, politicians had no moral or any kind of motivation to change the system if it was bad because they either didn't know or didn't care. But now they will have a personal motivation, an emotional motivation, because they will themselves experience how the situation is really wrong and and they will be able to change it because they affect the policies, because there are politicians that have the ability and the power to change. So because we believe that all the people deserve equal and all the lives and rights should be respected, we beg you to vote side proposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to call upon Aloysius to deliver his speech.
The proposition fundamentally didn't understand today's motion. It wasn't about these individuals being somehow more important and therefore we needed to drag them down to the bowels of society. It was about choice. If their side truly believes that all individuals should be equal, why would you deprive these individuals of their right to choice by virtue of their occupation? And what happens when you do that? In their second speaker, in response to our point of information, they outright conceded that they wanted, in effect, a communist society with absolute equality among individuals where everyone was, quote, equally poor. This was extremely detrimental because you harmed the politicians and you harmed the people. It impacted the running of your country, as I will elucidate in my argumentation. They finally deviated from the debate by never talking about what was the best way forward in the context of public healthcare. They never talked about the impacts to the people who were using these public healthcare, apart from saying that somehow dragging politicians down would lead to an improvement in this area. They never gave us a concrete link as to why this was so, but we'll take down their case anyway by deconstructing it with two key questions. Firstly, what happens to government? And secondly, what happens to society? On the first question of what happens to government and politicians, to begin with, we still haven't heard any mechanism coming from the proposition side that actually requires politicians to adhere to the motion. This is important because the very notion that this House would implies the introduction of a new policy requiring individuals to do so and an enforcement mechanism to ensure that all the benefits that they wanted to talk about would manifest. They haven't given us any such enforcement mechanism, and because of that, politicians are prone and indeed likely to evade all of the safeguards that they didn't have, and this results in no benefit whatsoever manifesting. Because my first speaker already told you how it's so easy to escape if they don't have a policy in place. Next came their second speaker substantive on the nature of politicians, and we reject that depiction entirely. Because firstly, we need to recognize how their first speaker set this debate in a democracy. And because it's a democracy, people have limited terms of office. Terms of office which is further specific to today's motion. Because they need to maintain their power in office for repeated terms of office, because they want to pursue re-election, they need the popular support of the people. And because they want the popular support of the people, they are necessarily incentivized to make the people's lives better, to portray themselves in a positive manner. And the means to do this, I'll take you in a moment, madam, the means to do this is to improve public health care by channeling funds into the appropriate areas and therefore ensuring that people are happy and people will vote for them. Go ahead.
If that was to be true and effective, then we wouldn't have healthcare in such a bad condition
Madam, what you don't understand is healthcare being in a bad condition has nothing to do with the allocation of funds in this instance, because it results from mismanagement at the ground level, but this can be resolved by the action of politicians. Your mechanism does nothing to improve healthcare because it only results in a further stratification between politicians and the healthcare system. No, thank you. None of this policy will come to pass because my first speaker already told you about the principle of body autonomy, how individuals need to have a choice of medical treatments. And to this, all they said was equality. They still didn't take down the key logic that in order to do so, no thank you, they would violate the rights of individuals to govern something so dear as their own health. And this was fundamentally unjustified, especially considering that it was your politicians who are running your country and deciding on all of your policies. They willingly conceded to this, and this is completely ludicrous. We next forwarded an argument on how the immediacy of healthcare was important, especially for the politicians who played a vital role in running your country. They never contested the fundamental idea that state-run hospitals would be ill-equipped, especially if they were located in areas that were far, far away from where the politicians were, so they couldn't access time-sensitive emergency services. This led to the deaths of these politicians. This led to reduced governance for the country. This was ludicrous. Moving on to the second question then, on what happens to society. And their side never elucidated a clear link. All of their rhetoric was false, because there was no private healthcare under their model. What happens in the absence of private healthcare is that you deprive individuals, even if they have the means, from that choice. You deprive individuals from a higher standard of healthcare, and you deprive them from even living. Because all are equal, all suffer. Because your public healthcare system ends up being overburdened as a result, and because of that, everyone suffers. In order to achieve equality, their side would achieve equality in a poor, poor state. That's all of their material dealt with. I'm now transitioning to my own constructive arguments. Firstly, on depriving the public of medical care. This argument will prove that politicians should not be forced to use state-run services, as it leads to the misallocation of resources in politicians' favor, depriving the remainder of the public of medical care in other sectors. The premise of this argument is how politicians, in their positions of power which they concede to, have the ability to channel funding to specific state-governed institutions. But because they want the best possible treatment for themselves, again using their own characterization, they will choose to channel government money into the types of medical care that are relevant to themselves, that cater to their own needs, and this is on an irregular, as-needed basis. This hence incurs an opportunity cost, as other areas of medical care that politicians are not interested in are starved of funding by this misallocation of resources, and there are no long-term improvements. It's precisely because of this mechanism that it deprives the public of medical treatment and exacerbates the disparity between the standard of care received by politicians and the standard of care received by the masses. Here's where we clash entirely with proposition's notion that public health care will be improved. This argument proves that it won't. We give you the example of President Islam Karimov, who channeled more than 24% of Uzbekistan's state healthcare budget to diabetes treatment because he himself was a diabetic. This led to a cut in funding to all other sectors of healthcare, such as accident and emergency, such as cardiac health. These healthcare services were in demand by the people, but were starved of funding because one president wanted to channel funds to himself. Therefore, because we don't want a misallocation of public resources, their policy must fall. Moving on to my final argument then, on disincentivizing people from becoming politicians. And here's again where we question their side on what tangible benefit will manifest for society as a whole. Because this argument proves that enacting such a punitive policy tarnishes the appeal of politics as an occupation, therefore reducing the country's leadership base in the long run. Because they were so determined to make everyone equal, their country lacked a government. We need to recognize two things. Firstly, that medical care is something immensely personal and valuable to the individual because their own life hangs in the balance. And secondly, once politicians are made to use state-run medical services, the public now expects them to apply this principle to other areas of their life. For example, education and travel arrangements. And all of this results in the occupation of politicians becoming strongly associated with the serious reduction of personal liberties that normal citizens would otherwise be entitled to. And therefore, even the most talented, leadership-capable individuals in society are deterred from assuming the job of politician. The result is that less people become politicians, you erode your leadership base, you prevent proper policies from being implemented because you lack competent leaders. We give you the example of Malaysia, how after they imposed the highest possible income tax bracket on politicians, which was completely disproportionate to their actual pay, the number of candidates for the next election dramatically decreased because less people wanted to become politicians. Therefore, because we want to maintain a strong place of leadership, and because we cannot clamp down on the rights of politicians because they are individuals at core, members of your society, we don't stand for a communist state, we stand for the choice of individuals.
Today's side opposition claims they value every human life the same, that they want every human to be healthy, to have access to healthcare, and to a decent life. And then in the same breath, they say that politicians who have more money have a right to choose their healthcare, and that they should have that they have more need of healthcare because they are in this position than any other person, and that their right to choose is so much more important than the right of the people. So I'd like to analyze this debate. Firstly, I'd like to negate their last argument about depriving the public of more medical care. Then I'd like to analyze this debate on the key issues of the justification of the policy, this point about efficiency, and then this point about the rights of politicians, and show you why proposition wins here today on a moral and principle and practical level. So first off, to their last argument we received about how we're depriving the public of more medical care. They say that we have the ability to channel money, that the politicians have ability to channel money into certain aspects, and that they're going to only channel money into areas where they specifically need it. First off, we say that politicians are in essence humans, Homo sapiens. They have the same body, so their general needs, of medical care aren't as different from the regular person. We don't see this logic about how politicians have very specific needs as a result of healthcare. They can still get a toothache, they can still get heartburn, or whatever other medical condition. We also say that their idea with this, their example with this one president, how he channeled it to diabetes. We say that there are I think at least 90 politicians within the parliament, and if everyone had that more politicians than just one is represented. So in that group of 90, we're bound to have a difference of these special types of medical needs. And we still say that this is better than the status quo, where the politicians don't feel a need to channel any sort of money into the public health care because they don't use it. They don't see what the condition is. They have access to private health care, which is faster and more convenient. Ergo, they do not know or do not care about the public healthcare, which is the only option for many other people. Now, moving on to this point, about justification. We brought you this idea that there is inherent divide within people, and that we want people to get access to healthcare on the same level. And they would refute this with saying we have the right to choice in things, and that we cannot distribute money, and so on and so forth. We say that while it may be true that if people have more money, they're entitled to more things, we have presented to you in our first argument that the right to health and the right to life is a basic value which cannot be measured in money. You cannot put a price on a human life, and it is in essence the duty of the government to provide equal health care for every single citizen that is in the country, because the right to health is the basic right for every other right. We say that if you have more material means, that doesn't give you more right to be healthy. Just like these politicians who have more material means don't get more rights to be healthy, because they constantly talk about this choice, about how people can have an inherent right, to choose what kind of medical care they're going to receive, and how politicians need this choice. We say that's all fine and dandy, but the fact of the matter is the majority of people don't may have the right to choose, but they don't have the ability to choose. And what we're doing with our policy is going for the principles of what is a politician. A politician is the first public servant. A politician is, as soon as he assumes office, is a representative of the majority of people who voted for him. That is to say, the people who do not get to enact that choice of choosing private or public healthcare. Therefore, he has to realize what the actual conditions are because of all the reasons my second speaker has told you about. Now, moving on to this point about efficiency, they still say how we're going to distinguish people, how we're going to regulate this, and so on and so forth. First off, we say that there is such a thing as, let's say, healthcare inspection. There is such a thing as law enforcement. You can have, like, private practices can have a list of public officials that they cannot admit. So I think it's pretty feasible. And as to the point about escaping, to another country, we see that if we're talking about this sort of policy within any sort of democracy, this would be implemented on a global scale. And if we're talking about public officials, they would have to be subjugated to the public healthcare of any country. And we also say that it is going to be efficient because we're going to make them walk a mile in the people's shoes. No, thank you. My second speaker has presented very clear logic on this point. That politicians generally tend to need, because when they become politicians, they're born in better off families, they get better education, they get better funding for a campaign, and so on and so forth. So they never really experience the true horrors of the public healthcare system, where people wait for 7 months for an operation. No, thank you. And therefore, they don't have an incentive or a motivation to fix this problem because they're too busy investing into buying cars for the government or whatnot. So we see that we need to show them the true situation within the government to do away with this polarization in order to have better policies. Yes, madam?
If you think that everyone should be equal, by logic, you would support communism.
Thank you, I'm getting to that. The fact of the matter is, we're not supporting communism. We're not for forcible redistribution of wealth. We're saying that this applies specifically to politicians because they are representatives of the people, of the majority of people, which we've shown to you that the majority of people across the world are those who cannot afford private healthcare. And because these public officials act and should act in the favor of these people, then it is only fair that we do this policy in order to get more money allocated to public health care instead of other areas which these politicians might deem important. Now, moving on to this last point about the rise of politicians. They say that private and public ideals and spheres are separate. We see that they're very much together. We see that the lifestyle and the effect and the whole personality of the politician is very important to what kind of policies he's going to take on. So if he doesn't see a need in his personal life to enact some sort of policy, then he is not going to work according to those ideals. So what we're in essence doing is offering them another experience, another point of view, so that they can appreciate what the actual status in the world is. We also say that, because they have a right to choose, we also say that the social contract that they're bound to, because they have to cater to all of the people, says that they have to provide this basic human right to everyone. They also say that politicians then will be taken ahead, that they will be given preferential treatment in public hospitals. We say that in public hospitals, people are understaffed, they have old equipment, and they don't have enough funding, and they're overcrowded. The doctors and the staff is probably going to be even more hostile towards the politicians, so because of the horrible conditions, and they will be even more incentivized to give more money to that. And then to the point about how politicians will be dying, we say that in the definition we excluded this because of the Hippocratic Oath. And then to the last point about how less people will be politicians, we say we agree with this and that we don't want politicians who are politicians simply because they get money. We want politicians who will be willing to walk a mile in the shoes of people and who will be willing to deal with the issues and not live in their high and mighty world where everything is allowed, everything is permitted, and they don't care about the general health of the population. So in order for the general welfare of the people, both sides property.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to call upon Annette to deliver her speech.
Proposition drew a false correlation between politicians going to get their healthcare services from hospitals and improvement in the quality of service. Because they just told us that these individuals will know the situation on the ground without actually proving to us the tangible outcome. In my speech, I'm going to be proving to you that even if on proposition side, they will never know the true situation on the ground. The second big flaw in proposition was that they simply tried to have arguments against capitalism and meritocracy, and in fact included aspects of communism as brought up in a POI earlier on. But then in their third speaker, they fundamentally contradicted what their second speaker told us. Because in their second speaker, they told us that they stood for the things like the redistribution of wealth amongst the entire community. Whereas in their third speaker, they blatantly said, no, this is already a contradiction within their entire case, and therefore they will not clear their stance right from the get-go. Which means that on one hand, they stood for communism, on one hand, they stood for aspects of communism, but yet didn't stand for it fully. But let's really tackle their policy once more. Because they tried to tell us that under proposition's policy, they would have it on a global scale, like they were going to, for example, maybe arrest the president. But that's really fundamentally impossible to do. Because things like the president controls almost all the kinds of things within society. For example, he can simply give himself a pardon, he can simply excuse himself. All these are the kinds of mechanisms which makes it impossible for you to arrest the president to actually fully implement proposition's policy, which is why their policy never actually had any effect within society at all. But the third problem with proposition was that they simply assumed that we were only giving politicians the right to choose. But that's really not true. Because under opposition's case, we told you right from the start that every single person has that particular right to choice. Not only politicians, not only the poor people, not only the rich people. Everyone has that particular right to choice. So with that framework in mind, let's examine this debate in two main points of contention. Firstly, what's best to improve the quality of healthcare service, and secondly, what's best for politicians. On the first idea, here was therefore substantive of the importance of healthcare. Firstly, we fundamentally agree that everyone does indeed have that particular right to healthcare, which is why we already have things like state-run healthcare, which my first speaker told you, which is why it's fundamentally free. But then on the second layer of analysis, we brought you that democracy in and of itself is enough to ensure that these things are good. But then in their second speaker, they told us that people have to choose the best out of the worst, which is why democracy in and of itself fails. Firstly, there's just an argument against democracy, but let's give you additional reasons why in a democracy is extremely important. Because going by their own characterization, that healthcare is extremely important, it means that once you solve the healthcare problems, you are able to get a large majority of votes to vote you into parliament or vote you out of parliament, which means that the competition is extremely stiff, and it ensures that politicians will ensure that they get the vote of the people. But more than that, we're going to argue that within democracy itself, there already exists the necessary feedback mechanisms to ensure that these sorts of feedback get to the politician, whether or not he goes on the ground to understand the situation at all. Things like feedback mechanisms, which ensure that politicians will get the news regardless of whether he goes on the ground to ensure that situation. So that's why outside is even better. But then in their third speaker, they told us that poor people don't have that particular ability to choose, which is why we should simply remove the right of every single individual to choose. That's really just flawed. Because these poor people don't have the ability to choose, all the more we should try to uplift them and give them that ability to choose. Meaning through things like subsidies, meaning through things like free healthcare, through things like giving them cheaper healthcare to ensure that they also have that particular ability to choose. Also things like education campaigns to ensure that the poor people are uplifted right from the start, to ensure that these individuals right from the start, when they grow up, are able to get better jobs. These are all things that democratic governments already do to ensure that poor people are uplifted, not only through subsidies, but also through things like education hours to show that everything within the hospital is fine and dandy and that there are no particular problems at all. Which means that the president will think that everything within the hospital is fine, that everything within the hospital is good because these state-run hospitals know that they are coming. I'll take it in a minute, madam. And this is even worse because it means that these politicians will now disregard all the feedback that they get from other sources because they now think that, hey, I've seen the situation on the ground for myself, I don't think there's any particular problem, I can simply disregard all the feedback that people have been telling me. And this is worse because it means that politicians no longer have that further incentive to continue improving the situation on the ground. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, doctors themselves face the horrible condition of healthcare and they will not put a facade on. Second of all, you are not only discussing presidents, you're also discussing mayors and such. It's a large number of politicians that people won't just turn off and make a facade.
So, madam, what you told us was that, firstly, it's not only these particular individuals. We tell you that it's extremely easy for these particular politicians to bypass any sort of situation. Because what happens when they come is that they only come for 2 to 3 hours and people can just simply put on their facade for maybe an entire day. But whether it's a situation on the ground, for 365 days, no politician is going to be there to know the long-term situation. And secondly, if the situation was really as bad as you told us that doctors really cannot survive with poor old equipment, they will simply go to the necessary feedback mechanism that already exists within a democracy with a separation of powers like the executive, the legislative, or for example the media to voice their particular concerns. And this is more than sufficient because within a democracy, these are mature democracies which can ensure that these are functioning entities which will give the necessary feedback. So if the situation was really as bad as you claim, then all the more they will simply go to the necessary feedback mechanisms. Now lastly on that, next on the idea of denying access to services, they simply told us that people have the same needs. Let's give you another reason for why that policy will never come about. Because these individuals can simply bribe the doctors for better treatments, to get on the waiting list, to get ahead of the waiting list, to get faster sorts of treatments, and that's why their policy never ever will never ever come and actually be effective. On the second idea, what's best for politicians? Firstly, on disincentivizing people from becoming politicians. Here they say, oh yeah, that's good because we want people who truly have a heart. But let's really look at the nature of politicians. We need individuals who are competent, individuals who can actually run the country. It is impossible to actually cut and actually tell the true motivations of politicians, which is why we need to ensure that they are extremely competent. Next on the idea of autonomy of politicians. Here they told us that it's extremely linked. No, ladies and gentlemen, which is why you can have a secular country and you can have a religious country, however, an asecular leader, because what happens is that the private and public sphere is extremely different. And lastly, on the needs of politicians, this was an idea completely dropped by proposition. They never responded to the immediate nature of politicians, that even if these politicians were given the right to choice, they should be, because they're integral in the running of the country, they're integral in making policies, they're integral in ensuring your country is kept well. So therefore, because we truly did what's best for everyone, I am proud to stand on opposition.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call upon Aloysius to summarize the opposition of this
In their quest for absolute equality, proposition neglected a few key things. Firstly, they didn't have a clear setup as to what kind of government they wanted to talk about. Was it democracy or was it communism? Secondly, they didn't have a policy that would actually ensure that the benefits they talked about on their side would even come to pass. The very motion this House would require needed this enforcement mechanism to require politicians to adhere to do so. They didn't have one, and because of that, politicians could easily escape using their own means. Because of that, their global scale of imposition was extremely impractical, and because of that, proposition fundamentally failed in their burden in today's debate. But even then, they never grounded their argumentation to healthcare specifically, instead giving us a groundless philosophical rant on what was essentially democracy, versus communism without rights. That was another key failure. Even if it was global, their mechanism of personal incentive wouldn't work. Because on opposition, we gave you convincing argumentation as to why this was so. How this flouted the body autonomy of the politician as an individual, how it prevented him or her from getting immediate medical care, which was essential, how it deprived the public because politicians could simply misallocate resources within the public framework, and how it ultimately disincentivized people from becoming politicians because they viewed the occupation as the stripping of their rights. All of this never directly responded to, only skirting the effects that we talked about, never tackling the key logic links that we presented to you. And because of that, they remain standing at the end of today's debate. Let's analyze this action in two key points. Firstly, on the idea of healthcare, and secondly, on the idea of politics. On the idea of healthcare, and here Proposition wanted to improve healthcare by making the politician, quote, walk a mile in the shoes of the poor. But this was fundamentally not true. We gave you a myriad of reasons why this mechanism on their side wouldn't work. Because politicians could just bribe the doctors, escape punishment, and become even more adverse to public healthcare mechanisms. Because there was already an existing feedback mechanism that existed to ensure the continual improvement of these state-run services. And under opposition, we had the mechanism of a democratic vote, the need to pursue the mandate of the people that served as a huge incentive for politicians to divert money into these state-run services to satisfy the people to remain in office. We talked about the misallocation of resources, how if their policies should come to pass, selfish politicians would only care about their own healthcare needs, divert systems from the public, and all of this would lead to the detriment of healthcare. Their only response to this was that politicians have a spectrum of healthcare needs. Even so, they never tackled the key logic about how this was prone to abuse and how this ultimately deprived the people as a whole. In the end, Proposition did nothing to improve public healthcare services. Let's move on to the second point on politics and politicians. And here, Proposition fundamentally wanted to viscerate the public-private division. They wanted the politician to change himself, to strip himself of rights, precisely because he was in this occupation. This was unjustifiable, because we have distinct private spheres and distinct public spheres. That's why in a secular state, you don't force your politicians to give up their own religion simply because it adheres to state ideology, so long as it doesn't interfere with his capacity to make decisions, with his capacity to perform in that job. This is especially essential because politicians form an integral part of your government, because they decide the policies that lift your country and bring it forward. They wanted to achieve a trade-off of rights, even when it wasn't necessary in the political context, even when the mandate existed to improve the public healthcare system, even when all individuals, because they so fought for equality, even when all individuals were entitled to their own rights. In the end, the right of the politician to body autonomy was infringed, the right to immediacy of healthcare was infringed. They killed politicians, they killed the country. Because they didn't do anything for public healthcare, while on opposition we did. I am more than proud to stand on the side that supports expedient health.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Christina to deliver the last in this debate.
I will discuss my revised speech in 5 major points. To start off with the first point, is the status quo bad enough for us to discuss these measures we are trying to implement? So this proposition was able to prove to you that yes, the status quo is bad enough because healthcare system is bad. There are enormous lines, equipment is bad. The doctors are being understaffed, the hospitals are being understaffed. These are the conditions we are living in. So we believe that something has to be done in order to correct the mistakes in the mechanism in the site we have. Second of all, we prove it to you that the status quo is bad enough because of the social gaps that make the majority hurt and this small minority whatever they desire, and this contributes in people being worse off. So we believe status quo is enough for us to discuss and implement these measures. Second point, is our implementation principally right to do? Yes, we believe it is. First of all, I would like to hear talk about this right to choice versus the conditions people actually have. This opposition constantly argued how people have the right to choose, how we are denying the right to choose what is best for them. First of all the people should have the right choose. And the only way to provide that right of choice to each and every citizen is to give that money from the politicians to make them change the policies so the people can have the right to choose also. This is the only way to do so. So we here are fighting for human rights, not like this opposition hypocritically saying they do, and another way say they do not. The point about how they said that politicians are really important because they need instant care because they run the state. First of all, we in our definition said that when we are not talking about emergency and death-threatening conditions, because in that way each and everyone has to be taken immediately by any kind of doctor. And second of all, we believe that the life and the importance of life applies to each and every citizen, and not only to politicians just because they have a different profession. We believe this should be applied for everyone to show and send the message politicians should do. Furthermore, to go to the point about social contract, to discuss here how we give a certain amount of rights away for the government to take care of us. This is a job of politician, what they should do, and they are not doing, so we should implement this in order to have so, as we currently mean what is the job of a politician. To move to another point, to the third point, the mechanism. We said, and we still stand high upon that mechanism here is pretty easy to implement because it is not hard to distinguish between a private hospital and between a public hospital and who can enter and who cannot enter. And implementing this on a global scale, we will of course avoid the people flying overseas and things as such. The point about how hospitals will bring up facade and pretend as if everything is okay so politicians will not see the true picture, we believe this will not happen as we have proven to because in my POI, doctors themselves know the horrible conditions, so they will not try to pretend because they themselves will try to improve the conditions and they will not be bribed because they know how healthcare system is bad. To move to the point, what will actually happen? On a short term, politicians may be a bit upset, but in the long term, they will see the horrible conditions and they will make the change. Will the change happen? Yes, it will, because they will have emotional and personal motivation. Is the change possible to happen? Yes, it is, because they are the ones that have the effect on the policy making, as we have proven to you. This brings me to the fourth point. Will the quality be affected? We have proven to you it won't be affected. Yes, it will be affected, but it will be positively affected because the system will be changed, the mechanism will change, and the healthcare system will be improved. So yes, quality will be positively affected and not negatively as today's opposite tried to persuade you. And to my last point, what regime are we actually discussing here? I am really sorry that today's opposition does not know the elements of a communistic regime because we on side proposition never said taking away all the money of all the rich and wealthy people, violate human rights, have one party in the elections. We are here talking democracy. We are only discussing taking away some of the access of the people, of the politicians, because they have the power to change it and do something about it. So because we believe all of us deserve the right to choose, and we believe that if you judges who walk into a hospital deserve just the same rights as if you were a politician,